I'm a third year student at the University of Toronto, currently studying history with minors in political science and education and society. I actually was lucky enough to work at OneHub last year as an education program officer, and I'm excited to share some insights about a nonprofit organization that I'm a part of, Markham Model United Nations. So excited to talk more about that.
Amazing. With all that out of the way, before you get started, and in like 10 seconds, I'm going to ask you more about your not for profit. I'm just quickly just to do a land acknowledgement. We begin today by acknowledging the traditional territories of Indigenous peoples and their commitments to stewardship of the land. We acknowledge the communities encircled the north, west, south, and eastern directions, and the Haudenosaunee, Huron-Wendat, Anishinaabe, Seneca, Chippewa, and the Mississaugas of the Credit peoples. We share the responsibility with the caretakers of this land to ensure the dish is never empty and to restore relationships that are based on peace, friendship, and trust. We are committed to reconciliation, partnership, and enhanced understanding. I hope I pronounced those names right. With all that being said, Aryan, quickly, do you want to talk more about what your not-for-profit corporation specifically does?
Yeah, so MarkMun, or the Markham Mun organization, is a nonprofit organization that was founded it would be September 2024. So what we are is we're an organization that is entirely student ran. We're effectively organized by university students, university student ran, and we organize an annual Model United Nations conference, a debate conference for high school students who participate in them from across the GTA and even from across the other provinces in Canada. And we draw in a significant amount of students who want to engage in public speaking, want to engage in debate on critical issues affecting our society, and some fun ones as well. And the main purpose of our organization is not only to organize this conference on an annual basis by collaborating with our high school organizers, but also to benefit the community with the money that we earn by giving it back to charity and obviously taking the earnings from this conference and giving back to the community that helped make us.
That's that's sorry. Mm, Sorry. Nerves. But that's actually incredibly impressive. I do want to ask specifically, can you tell me more about why you started the corporation or your not-for-profit specifically, or what inspired you to start this? Because this is a lot. You mentioned you started in high school, right?
Yeah, so Markman started pretty much right after I graduated high school. So I'm going into my third year now at the University of Toronto, but we go back to June of 2024 to find Markman's origins, where I actually texted a friend of mine to talk about potentially holding a Model United Nations conference in Markham, something that hadn't happened before up to that point, and something that we thought would bring a benefit to the community and students who could engage in a public speaking opportunity. And that's where it started. We got together a group of myself and him, who were both current university students, along with a group of high school students to organize our first conference. And we decided that the best way to go forward with that would be to found a non for profit corporation to work towards not only benefiting the students that were participating in this conference, but the community at large by giving back. That process obviously had a lot of difficulties attached with regards to registering our nonprofit, making sure that we were abiding by the rules and regulations. But once we were able to sort it all out and had MarkMun officially founded in September, we were able to put forward our name first as one of the biggest multi-UN conferences to come out of Markham, or sorry, to come out of Markham, and it still exists to this day. In fact, our conference this year will be running sometime in late November. So in the third iteration coming up this year, we're hoping to bring in upwards of 300 to 400 delegates. So significant growth, and our ability to give back to the community has followed that.
All right, that's amazing. And I want to ask you more about the incorporation process in a bit. First, specifically just defining not-for-profit corporations, because this is going to become relevant later, especially when we talk about charities. Importantly, though, they are not charities. They're separate from charities, and there's a process you would need to register for charities. Also, oddly, they are defined as being able to make a profit to some degree, although it's specifically not with the intention to make a profit. The key difference at a fundamental level for a not-for-profit corporation, specifically versus a for-profit corporation, is that not-for-profit corporations fundamentally do not have shareholders. So for-profit corporations have shareholders, and they can issue, and you could buy shares, they can issue shares, and they can give dividends or financial payments to their shareholders. Not-for-profit corporations don't have this. Instead, of shareholders, they have members who fundamentally still vote on resolutions. They still have voting voting rights in the actual the corporation, but they don't actually profit from the corporation. It's not invested in or run for any profit, just like as the name implies. There's also specific you can only make it for specific purposes, which will become more important when we actually discuss making a like whether you should turn a not-for-profit into a charity in the first place. All right. Importantly, I'm guessing, or like Arian, the main reason a lot of people do make not-for-profits specifically to help people. There's some charitable, although this is going to be in quotations because there's some difference, but specifically the pursuit in mind is usually not profitable, or you are not doing this for a profit incentive. You are often doing this for some community benefit in the first place. As we'll get into later, the actual purposes of a not-for-profit can literally be anything as long as it's specifically not run with a profit in mind in the first place. As well, again, it's specifically not charities. These are their own separate entities. Importantly, I want to talk about incorporation before we talk to Ari more about about the actual process of incorporation. This is very simple. Incorporations is fundamentally just officially registering your not-for-profit corporation with the federal government. It's specifically done under the Canadian Not-for-Profit Corporations Act. I'll just call it the Not-for-Profit Act from now on. This is unique from for-profit corporations, which are incorporated and run under the the Canadian Business Code. So these are it's basically run under a separate separate legislation. However, the actual fundamentals or law of incorporation itself and running the corporation is fundamentally quite analogous to running a for-profit and starting and incorporating a for-profit corporation. So a lot of this is actually quite similar and quite applicable. Fundamentally, the big benefits of incorporating is, well, first it's that the corporation actually becomes official. Your not-for-profit actually becomes official, so it's kind of like the baseline. But specifically, there's a lot of benefits, which I'll talk to Ari more about, including specifically, you have all right to use your name specifically or if you want. You have limited liability, which we'll talk more about, but essentially just means that you aren't you to some degree are less liable for as a corporate basically for what the corporation does. Although this comes with certain asterisks. You have lower corporate tax rates and you have better access to capital and grants. As well, there is a $200 flat fee to incorporations. The specific documents you need to incorporate are fundamentally the articles of incorporation and your basically initial form or your initial direct board of directors. The articles of incorporation fundamentally worked a bit like a constitution for your company. It essentially it sets out the name of the corporation, where it's going to be situated, the classes of members that are authorized to vote in your company, and we're going to talk about members more later again, and directors, the number of directors you can have in your corporation, the statement of the purpose of the corporation, which is important for a not-for-profit, restrictions on what the corporation can do, and essentially what will happen if the corporation liquidates, or if you end the corporation, who gets what assets or what property that the not-for-profit owns. As well, there's also, again, your initial registered office and your first board of directors. Now that that's out of the way, before we talk about what you do after this, or after you apply and get incorporated, I want to talk to Aryan. Can you talk about your experience specifically incorporating what that was like for you?
Yeah, for sure. So, as a bunch of, myself as a recently graduated high school student, along with one university student and a couple of high schoolers, this process was very daunting. Obviously, taking that on as effectively a bunch of students with zero experience, except on the Model UN side, of course, so the actual conference itself. The actual process of learning how to start a nonprofit and how to do so effectively and legally under the guidelines that are provided by the Government of Canada was definitely a process. It involved a lot of, funny enough, Liam, what you probably did to prepare for this workshop. So going online and researching what are the several regulations that are involved with a nonprofit. Will they in any way conflict with our ability to run the conference? And as a result, is it worthwhile to do so? And what we eventually decided was, yeah, it is beneficial and it would be in our interest to register as a nonprofit for a couple of reasons. The majority of which I'll get into later, but I think the one major one was the benefit of incorporating and the benefit of a name brand. Obviously, our conference, Mark One, was a completely brand new initiative, a completely brand new idea. And the whole goal with it not only was to represent the community and to empower the community with something that it could claim for itself, a conference that it could claim for itself, but a lasting organization that would be able to make a difference into the future through a variety of endeavors, mainly charitable ones, by giving back to the community through financial means. And we found that the best way to do that was going through the government's website by forming a board of directors and ultimately defining what the purpose of our corporation would be, which was to run a conference on an annual basis, to use the income from that conference to obviously make sure that we're running properly, and then after that to use our profit amount towards giving back towards the community to key charitable organizations.
Hmm. That's a really good answer, Aryan. Specifically, you mentioned the privileges that you got from incorporating as a non-for-profit, and I want you to go more can you go more into that if that's okay? Specifically, why have or like we talked about this, but like what are the main benefits you've gotten for not from incorporating as a not-for-profit?
Yeah, well, you mentioned a couple of them already. Obviously, the ability to use your name across the country and globally is obviously quite beneficial. But generally speaking, when it comes to our relationships with the government and with external organizations, our status as a nonprofit tends to benefit us because our focus is not towards just making a bunch of money and keeping it all for ourselves or our shareholders, but actually giving back to the community. It's a very selfless endeavor. And because of that, we're generally speaking enabled to do a number of things. So, for example, whenever we have room bookings that we're sorting out, we're able to do so at generally a pretty lower rate because, for example, community centers and schools obviously want to partner with us. They want to work with us to benefit the community. And overall, that's one benefit. But aside from that, we also have the benefit of, like you mentioned, reduced liability and also for tax purposes. Unlike a major corporation where we may potentially be taxed if we make a certain amount of money, that amount is much more lenient for nonprofits, where until you reach a certain amount of profit that is made, I believe around $15,000, you actually don't get taxed for that amount. So we're able to put the full money into the community directly as intended. So there's a number of benefits that come with it. For our students as well who participate in helping to run the conference due to our official status and not just being an organization in name, we actually are able to give out volunteer hours as well. So if you want to recruit students to be able to help out with your organization, whether it be to run events or to organize workshops like this one, you're able to do so by having an official status and giving out volunteer hours, which is obviously a big incentive to bring people into the project.
Okay, so it sounds like one of the biggest benefits is that it helps with relationship building, if I'm reading this correctly. Like just being a not-for-profit or being incorporated means it's a lot easier to get work with people and build relationships. Is that true?
Yeah, absolutely. We've also found it pretty beneficial to have our status as a nonprofit, especially when working with our venue partners. For the past couple of years, it's been the York Region District School Board, where we've held our conference for the past 3 years. First at Purely Trudeau High School, then at Unionville High School, and this coming year at Milliken Mills. So 3 years in a row, having a strong existing relationship with the YRDSB that is proven by our commitment to the community and our loyalty, obviously, to the venue provider, we've been able to get the conference venue at pretty significantly reduced rates, even for a regular nonprofit. So that relationship itself, and again, our ability, like a school board, to give back to those involved. Obviously, school boards don't work at a profit, thankfully. They too want to see endeavors that improve the community. And what better way to do that than a high school conference for its own students to potentially participate in?
Okay. That's a great answer. Thank you. Finally, I want to ask about specifically the other part of Incorporated, which is essentially picking the board of directors. We talked about this a little bit, but I'm interested in how you actually found the process of this. Like, was it easy to find people who would be willing to do this in the first place? Was it like very intimidating? If you could just elaborate on that.
Yeah, so myself and my friend who were co-organizing the conference at the time, he effectively had a second in command role. We ended up taking on the first duties as the chair and vice chair, respectively, of the organization. And from there, we were able to figure out our process for recruiting the board of directors. And while we could have gone with pretty much any process involved of recruiting people just from Markham or from the community or who have done Model UN before, we decided to specifically narrow in on individuals who had helped make the conference happen. So we obviously set a requirement that board of director members would have to be 18 years old at some point during their appointment in order to make sure that they are valid legal officers. But beyond that, we also wanted to recruit some of the very staffers who made our conference happen. So we actually went to high school students and we asked them if they would like to be a part of Mark Munn's founding board of directors. And those individuals remain involved to this day in our third iteration. Some of whom have risen to become a new vice chair of the, or sorry, a new co-chair alongside me on the organization. But aside from that, there are also a number of individuals who have stuck around as just regular board of directors members. So those are our legal officers for the organization who are responsible for its operation internally, and also our partnerships with external organizations. So it's been key to really recruit from within to be able to keep that knowledge in house and also be able to continue to, again, make a difference in the community because the very people who are involved in the conference as organizers to help out other high school students are now helping our organization succeed at a much wider level.
Okay. So, and just to be clear, like a lot of they're not getting paid. Like the people who became your board of directors were entirely volunteer, like just out of passion, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Our entire board of directors and our entire staff, so every single high schooler, university student, etc., who helps run our conference and keep our organization afloat, nobody makes a dime. And the reason we set it up like that was so that we can, again, maximize our ability to give back to the community. Something in the long term that we've theorized potentially doing is if our organization grows big enough, potentially hiring someone to handle auditing for the organization for obvious reasons to make sure that we're complying with Government of Canada regulations, particularly when we reach a tax bracket that requires us to start paying taxes. But beyond that, we've also made sure that among our organization, the reason that we decided not to benefit anybody individually, at least as of yet, is because we wanted to maximize our ability to give back. Once Mark One eventually gets to a state where there is a potential for those things, perhaps it'll be discussed. But at the moment, our focus is solely on giving back to the community and running that conference for the benefit of high schoolers.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And just to ask, I know you mentioned giving back to the community. What charity, like how have you found working with charities? And I guess giving your, or I guess yeah, how have you found it working with charities specifically and fundraising?
Yeah, so the two organizations in our first year that we chose to give back to were the Markham Stouffville Hospital through their Oak Valley Health branch, and also the Markham Food Bank. So those were the two major organizations that we donated to in the first cycle of our conference, and those were our biggest donations to date. And we found working with both of those organizations very beneficial. MSH, we donated to both organizations. I believe the amount was $600 for a collective $1,200. So a significant amount of money that we were able to donate to those local organizations. We actually had a speaker from the Markham Food Bank come to the first iteration of our conference to talk about the benefit that this money would be providing towards the community and towards individuals who needed it. And of course, at Mark One, we obviously care about the veracity of our public health system. We obviously want to make sure that those in need who rely on public health care to live, to function, are being helped in any way possible. And the donation amount that we gave funded some pretty significant projects at Oak Valley Health. So we've maintained a close relationship with them today and maintained those contacts. And it really goes to show that one benefit of creating a nonprofit organization that not a lot of people talk about is you really get to form a wider community and engage within your community in general, just outside of your whole operation as a nonprofit. So it's really something inspiring.
Perfect. Yeah, that actually sounds amazing. I guess what are the I guess like actually no, it's okay. I'll ask more about about charities later. But thank you so much. At this point, at this point, I'm just going to briefly talk about what you do after incorporations. And a lot of this is going to talk more about the specific structure of directors and members. The first thing you want to do after you incorporate, or one of the first things you want to do, is specifically provincial registration. So often, after federally incorporating, you need to register essentially with the province where your nonprofit is actually located in, or wherever you end up practicing. So if you want to practice in Ontario, you would need to register with the Ontario government, or your nonprofit with the Ontario government. Each province has their own website detailing the exact steps of provincial registration. It's also worth noting you may need provincial permits to carry out certain activities depending on what your not-for-profit is actually supposed to be run for. So, i.e., if you run if you for some reason your not-for-profit sells something like alcohol, for example, you need a permit depending on what the province you're in. Things like that. Essentially, you need to just research with the province about the specific activities and permits you may need to obtain. That's the important first step. Not second, but at this point, we're going to talk about the directors because this has already come up to some degree. The directors are the people who are fundamentally running the corporation to some degree. Um, it's all, obviously there's a relationship, but directors help do a lot of the specific organization. They have a large duty to the corporation. The general duties of the board is specifically to manage the affairs of the corporation, specifically within the best interests of both the purposes the not-for-profit was run for, and to the benefit of the members of the not-for-profit corporation who are helping to run it for that specific purpose. There's some specific qualifications to be a director, as in usually you have to be 18 years old, you can't be bankrupt, you can't, and you have to be a specific individual. So you can't be a corporation or organization and be a director. It has to be a specific person, and you cannot be declared incapable. So if you have dementia, for example, it's probably or like substantial dementia, it may be very difficult to be declared as a director. Essentially, your term ends often when you die or resign, you're removed from office, or often when your term ends as well. Usually, this is around a term of 4 years. The main responsibilities of directors are, again, to represent the position of the trust they hold with respect to the corporation, and specifically to run it to the benefits of that corporation and the members. Specifically, they're held to an objective standard of care. And legally, to be very brief, legally, this just means that often they just need to be like held to is it a lower legal standard? Basically, it just means if they're sued or if it's an issue, if they were acting within the benefits of their corporation, it's going to be determined if they were by basically what a reasonable person would think, or a reasonable person with average knowledge would think of how they acted in the first place. So someone just needs to think that they would act somewhat reasonably. It's a lower legal standard. As well, you have a duty to comply with the Not-for-Profit Act and its regulations, or all its regulations, articles, and bylaws, and any oh, my bad. Sorry, misclick. Any unanimous member agreements. You're also liable to repay the corporation if they make payments to members, directors, or officers that are contravening the Not-for-Profit Act, or if essentially someone incurs losses or damages that were contrary to the act, you may need to pay that person. It's essentially it's called an indemnity. As well, not most importantly, but incredibly importantly, you also need to disclose any conflicts of interest you have in any dealings you have as a corporation, or specifically or specifically as a director as well. So this means that if you make a resolution, which we'll talk about later, you potentially can personally benefit from this resolution, you would need to be very clear with your members or the other directors that you have a personal stake in the resolution. This is incredibly, incredibly important because, again, you're running this corporation specifically for the benefits of your members and the charitable purpose. It cannot be for your own personal benefit. As well, you can appoint officers. The rough gist is that officers are basically hold important functions in the corporation, as in you can appoint people as the chairpersons of the board or like as president, treasurer. Basically, officers are people who help run the corporation, or help hold certain positions within the corporations and run important duties. As well, they can be remunerated or they're allowed to be reasonably remunerated for certain expenses that they take and they perform for the corporation specifically outside of their specific role in the corporation. So if they act not just in their role as a director, but as another position. So let's say if they act as an accountant and director, they would be allowed to be reasonably remunerated for acting as a accountant. They don't get remunerated for acting as a director. It's only if they act outside their role for the corporation. As well, the way directors are elected, as Orian's already alluded to this, but the way they're elected outside of the initial board you put together is specifically by members. There's a couple exceptions here, but one of the important functions of members is specifically choosing who actually gets elected as directors. The two big exceptions are that articles can permit directors to appoint additional directors between annual meetings to hold office. However, this is for a term that has to expire on or before the next annual meeting of members. The rough summary here is that this is largely a temporary position, and you cannot have that many appointed directors. It has to be roughly 1/3 of the number of directors that was elected at the last annual members meeting. Second, vacancies on the board can be filled by directors so long as there's a quorum on the board of directors who that participate in filing the vacancy. So as long as a majority of the directors agree, you can have certain vacancies be filled. The first directors meeting largely establishes all of the baselines of the corporation. Uh, and the most important thing they end up doing, although not the only thing, is specifically making bylaws, which we're going to talk more about later, and help end up forming the guidelines of how the corporation conducts itself both internally and externally. Similarly, you also start maintaining corporate records, which is very important, as we'll talk about later. You can issue debt obligations in the first debt obligations. You can appoint officers, and if you need, you can appoint an interim public accountant at the first directors meeting. Essentially, this sets the baseline for what the baseline of the infrastructure of the corporation. We'll talk about members, and then we can go more on bylaws specifically. And then yeah, and then we'll ask more about Aryan. Or also, Aryan, feel free to jump in at all if you have something that you want to share. First, members are the voting group behind your corporation, or they specifically vote for basically on specifically who gets to be a director in the first place, and they have to confirm new bylaws and amendments to existing bylaws. So essentially, most all of the changes that the directors propose at directors meetings has to pass through members specifically. There's certain differences in types of resolutions, but that's getting in the weeds, and we won't have getting in the weeds. Regardless, you need member approval to actually get to actually make most major changes. So your members have to approve most of what the directors think should get done, anyways. Importantly, you do have there are often classes of members. The articles of incorporation often create conditions behind those classes. So you can have multiple classes of members, and there are specific conditions behind who could be a certain class. So, for example, what the function is that often this just restricts who is actually allowed to become a member and have voting rights within the corporation, although there are non-voting members as well. Members usually are not liable for any liability the corporation takes on, i.e., debt. However, this is unless they act outside of their capacity as a member. So, like the example I mentioned earlier with directors, if they act as an accountant, for example, or something outside of just being a member and fulfilling their role as a member, they may now become liable for issues within the corporation. Basically, the rights and responsibilities of members are that members are one who directors are supposed to be running the corporation for. They are essentially they often there are most of the members, although not all of them, there are non-voting members, have voting rights, and so they're basically essentially they basically have the ability to vote and the ability to define what the corporation does. As well, if they have multiple member classes, they importantly can vote vote together or in blocks. So they can agree to vote as, for example, as a certain class of member. If, for example, let's say there's multiple classes, there's two classes. Class A, maybe a certain Class A is allowed to agree and vote and to pass a certain resolution, and Class B maybe disagrees with that resolution. They're allowed to, and then the two would basically negotiate. Essentially, there's certain they're able to basically congregate their votes. Essentially, they're also entitled to receive corporation's financial statements. So to hold the directors accountable, they're able to make sure that to monitor the financial statements of the corporation. Importantly, members' meetings are specifically where resolutions are passed, and where they vote on what the directors propose, i.e., often at directors meetings they propose bylaws, and at members meetings they're often voting on what directors have agreed to put to the members. Specifically, that notice has to be given to every voting member, director, and public account of the actual date of the annual member meeting. As well, the directors usually set the agenda. However, members can raise issues at these meetings. So these are called members' resolutions. They're allowed to raise the voting issues that other members can vote on. However, the basically main caveats that directors don't have to include this if, for example, this is improper. So if it's irrelevant to the statement of the corporation, if it's intended to enforce personal claims or grievances, or if it's repetitive. So if I tried and set two resolutions for the past 2 years, and it gets shot down both times, the directors probably aren't going to let me set a third one, just to not waste time. As well, if specifically for certain it may need to meet certain requirements. For example, it may need to be signed by you may need certain like at least like 5% of approval for if you're like trying to nominate someone as a director. You basically there may be a certain threshold. A lot of this is up to the actual bylaws of the corporation. First, we'll talk about bylaws in a bit, but first, I want to discuss. I want to discuss. Aryan, what's your? Can you? I guess you already mentioned briefly, but like specifically, can you talk about the actual structure of your corporation, or how it kind of fits with this?
Yeah, so with regards to the way that Mark One runs, or the Mark One organization, to be more accurate, um, effectively we have, in a way, a three-tiered system. So at the top, we have our board of directors, who are the legal officers for the organization. We specifically have two in name, which is myself and Luca, the other co-founder. So we are the individuals who hold the most legal responsibility for the organization. It's our name on the government documents, and ultimately, if anything were to go wrong, it would be us who would take liability for that. And then we have our board of directors, who obviously share that legal responsibility. And then below the board of directors, at the second tier per se, is the secretariat. Those are the high schoolers who are elected by specifically the two leaders of the secretariat, the secretary general and the director general, are the individuals charged with ensuring the conference can operate at a adequate level, and effectively ensuring that the conference, the actual main event that the organization is meant to run, is running at peak capacity. And it is entirely high school ran. So that secretariat helps actually organize the conference itself. They do most of the heavy lifting. And then we have our general staff. So these are individuals, again, at the high school level, who will actually participate in the conference. This is our biggest body of people. Again, this is effectively our members, if you will, along with the secretariat. But these individuals will, generally speaking, help to organize the conference and help to ensure its proper operation. So that's kind of the general structure of the Markham Munn organization in its proper form. And obviously, if you go into more detail, you can explain the pyramid, but that's broadly what it looks like. And in terms of how our organization functions, for the majority of the time, it is the secretariat taking on the day-to-day operations of the conference to make sure that we are running at proper capacity, to make sure that our finances are in order, and the general members, aka the staff, help to ensure the conference's proper operation. And again, these staff are all volunteers from across the GTA and beyond potentially, who are helping to ensure the conference can operate at peak capacity. And then above that, at the top level, we have our board of directors featuring the two legal officers. And we're the ones who are making sure above the secretariat, effectively, that things are operating properly. The way I like to imagine it, half jokingly, but if I'm being honest, kind of legitimately, is we're like the parents of the secretariat. We're trying to make sure that everybody's following the rules, that nobody's breaking the law, quite literally, and that we're there when the secretariat needs a helping hand. Because obviously, as adults and as people who have been involved with the organization in its running and in its organization, we have that bit of knowledge that we can carry on in order to ensure the conference's proper operation year over year. And we've been pretty successful at that. Obviously, that relationship has been further defined as the years have gone on to make sure that responsibilities are clarified and the way that we engage with, for example, external organizations is clarified. But broadly speaking, it's a very collaborative relationship between all three branches, if you will.
Okay, so I want to ask about a couple things here. First, you mentioned that it's only like you and Luke as you're the only director people on the board. That's a lot of responsibility, right? Like
Yeah, so we're the legal officers. So we're the ones on the government documents. Our actual board of directors, I believe, encompasses seven people. So the way
okay,
that it's structured is two co-chairs and then five directors. So co-chairs who are also directors and lead the board's operation. So those are the individuals in charge of running meetings, ensuring its proper operation. But on the government documents itself, just to maintain a sense of consistency and a sense of continuity, it remains myself and Luca, and we were the conference's first organizers back in 2024.
and I know you mentioned you obviously had to do a lot of research at the start. Just I want to ask about like I guess researching your legal about being a director and the liabilities you've had. I guess how strenuous was this? Because this seems like a lot for like high school, and I guess has this benefited you? Because I imagine it's helped you develop a lot of skills, just even just like being aware that this exists, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think one of the biggest steps was definitely money in the beginning because obviously as a high schooler, money isn't just flying off of trees. You need to be able to access partnerships and access funds from somewhere. And one thing that, being a director on the nonprofit has taught me is the importance of budgeting and what kind of work goes into budgeting, particularly for a long-term plan. Generally speaking, as a nonprofit, we have to plan effectively from January all the way to December every single year without fail. And we have to account for missteps. We have to account for potentially lower registration rates at the beginning compared to later on. And those are things we had to manage. In our first year, we had a budget of around $7,000. In our second year, that jumped to well over $10,000. So again, there's been significant growth, significant exponential growth, I would argue, for the organization. But that's involved a big learning curve. It's involved, my as one of the first organizers, giving a lot of advice to subsequent secretariats and subsequent high school students who are running this conference to make sure that they're running things obviously with ambition and with passion for the project to run this conference, but also with enough restraint to be able to run that in a way that doesn't obviously hurt them and doesn't hurt the organization. Because at the end of the day, while we want to benefit the community and while we want to give back as much as we can, our first goal is to make sure that we're obviously breaking even as an organization, because we don't want any of our members or of the people on the board to obviously have to take legal or financial losses for anything that happens. So that's been a very successful mission in our 2 years of operation. We're hoping, knock on wood, it stays the same for our third year. So far, it's looked pretty successful, though. Our conference has already gotten outreach to, I think, well over 100 high school students about showing up for this conference. So we're looking forward to another successful iteration.
Yeah, and I just want to point out a lot of these people are like the people who vote on the corporation are high school volunteers. That is very impressive. I imagine that that I'd hope that, or it seems like that would be a very good learning experience as well, or just being able to vote on the board, right, and dictate the directions of the corporation.
Yeah, absolutely. We run our annual AGM in and around December of each year, and it's a very important process that we have as a part of our conference. In order to make sure that our general members have a say in its operation and have a say in how our conference also looks, because it's a two-tiered experience. Obviously, the conference for most of the members is kind of the main point that they're focused on. But above that, you have obviously, just generally speaking, how the organization itself is ran. So it's a very important two tiers of operation within the conference. And we're lucky that for 2 years in a row, and so far for our third year, we've had very strong relationships between the board and the secretariat and our members, and the board and the membership. So it's been a very strong relationship, a very open and honest one. And I find that one of the most important things to do is to just be open and be transparent. What are our capabilities? What are our goals? And work with our members and work with obviously the secretariat, who are the main people who make things happen, to make sure that as a conference we can come out successful every single time.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Um, at this point, I'm just going to briefly talk about bylaws, and then we'll talk more about the distinction between charities and not-for-profits. Specifically, bylaws, just to quickly get through this, are just basically the rules for governing and operating the corporation. This is one of the first things you create. You can modify it later, though. Importantly, and I want to highlight this because this does seem like probably one of the most intimidating things. The federal government does have a website that allows you to, that gives you a link where you're able to, that basically picks bylaws for you. So they can give you a quiz, and that would basically pick out bylaws that would suit your not-for-profit corporation. Given that this can be very intimidating, I recommend you use it. This is a really good, cool resource. Specifically as well, there's a second important relationship between bylaws and the Not-for-Profit Act I want to highlight, which is that often if bylaws are silent, there are certain default rules within the Not-for-Profit Corporations Act, which basically operate in place of any bylaws. Essentially, a lot of these is on subjects of, for example, like defining who can serve as a director or how long they can serve, or who can serve as a member, for example. Specifically, it's important to know these rules and to research these because you can change your bylaws in the first place to essentially you could basically, if you define your bylaws, you basically override those general rules. So if you don't have anything on those any bylaws on those, it's presumed that the default rules from the Not-for-Profit Act apply. But if you do have something that is contrary to the Not-for-Profit Act, in this case, it overrides the Not-for-Profit Act. So you actually are able, in these cases, to define specifically certain aspects of how your corporation is run, because obviously this is like something that to a degree is very that it needs to be tailored to your organization. Uh, very briefly, you can see like often like basic quick pictures of the actual default rules. A lot of this is again specifically on your financial statements on borrowing powers, for example, who can be a member in the first place, how meetings are held, how many people need to vote, or how many members need to vote to pass a resolution in the first place, and similarly, who can actually be a director in the first place as well. So at this point, I want to come back to the charity discussion. Aryan, you mentioned that you work with a lot of charities, but you're specifically not a charity, correct?
Yeah, so the Markham One organization is defined both in its constitution and also in our relationship with the government of Canada as a non-for-profit. There's a couple of very specific reasons that we actually decided to do that that I'll dive into, I guess, now. Obviously, with a charity, I think the main difference that most people will generally go to first is that there's a lot of financial regulations in place that are levied on charities because they obviously take on such an important role in society. Whereas non-for-profits are generally able to, again, focus on the benefit of the community, and are a lot more laid back by nature, and very importantly, will do their best to benefit the community. With that general liability, charities have a lot stricter regulations involved. And what we found when we were going through the process of deciding whether we were going to do one or the other, we determined that our ability to operate as a not-for-profit would ultimately prove more beneficial to organizing the conference and being able to bring money and obviously reimburse those who had provided towards the conference's funding, to make sure that we were running, first of all, immediately at a break even, and then beyond that, being able to give back to those charities so that they could better operate in the community.
Yeah, that's actually a perfect answer. And that's very good summary to what I was briefly going to cover later, which is that basically charities are much more scrutinized than not-for-profits. Outside of, I think, as you mentioned, believe they're called soliciting not-for-profit corporations. So those that make over, like, I believe it's 10K in public grants or public gifts and grants. Outside of these, even with those, this will like basically subject to much less scrutiny than charities are, which is very important. Specifically, the on the purpose level, the government does actually legally define what not-for-profits and charities can be created with the purpose for differently. So not for the specific not purposes that not-for-profits can be for are essentially social welfare, civic improvement, pleasure, recreation, and hilariously, any other purpose except for profit. So it is a bit vague, but the general purpose is there. It isn't specifically for charitable purposes, which is a bit more defined. Specifically, charities, again, have to apply for charities, and they have to be established basically for the relief of poverty, advancement of education, and the advancement of religion, or other purposes that benefit the community. Again, it is a bit vague, but a lot of it comes down to that charities do have certain benefits that they're able to get as an basically often they're able to give tax receipts, for example, and because they're often universally exempt from things like income tax, whereas not-for-profits are usually exempt from income tax, but not always. They're subject to they're much more heavily regulated than not-for-profits are. Basically, I think Ariane already went over the pros very well for charities. I think but often, yeah, you can issue receipts, you can receive debt from other registered charities, but there are specific limits. Again, a lot of these, some of these are do count for not-for-profits as well, but specifically, a lot of the point of this is just to show that charities are more heavily regulated, or they are more heavily limited than not-for-profits are, and this should heavily inform your decision. So basically, if you're considering making a not-for-profit or a charity, because it can be easy to conflate the two, not-for-profits are given more leeway, but they're less they get less benefits. Oh, also importantly, certain provinces do prevent directors from receiving any amount of reasonable remuneration, which I talked about a bit earlier. As in, if they act outside of their role as a director, some provinces do limit this. Outside of this, essentially, that's a rough breakdown for charities. Specifically, at this point, briefly just on maintaining your incorporation status, and then then at this point we're going to shift more heavily towards just asking Arian questions, because at this point a lot of this is going to be about Arian's experience running his not-for-profit. Essentially, the main way you do this is basically the most important thing is filing your annual returns. Do your taxes. It's pretty cheap, but you do have to. It's less rigorous than charities, which have certain forms and more forms they have to and returns they have to file. But it's like do your taxes. As well, keep your corporate records. Again, it's more rigorous for charities, but you still need to keep corporate records for specific for how your not-for-profits ran. A lot of this specifically comes down to things like your articles of incorporation, which again makes sense. The minutes of the basically tracking the meetings of members, so the tracking the resolutions of members, any debt obligations that your company has issued. Again, the directors register, so everyone who's a director, where they live, their name, specifically how they can be reached, when they became a director, when they would cease being a director, and as well the same with officers, which I talked about earlier, and members, and again your accounting records. So basically, a lot of these are public documents. Also you have to file bylaws that are confirmed and amended, as well as your you have to submit your financial statements specifically as a soliciting corporation. Importantly, bylaws and financial statements are public documents and can be requested by anyone. Um, with that being said, that's roughly how you would be maintaining it. At this point, I want to shift more towards talking to Arden about his experience. Uh, so like a bit more informally. So, Arden, I guess we talked about this a bit earlier, but like, I guess can you talk to me about how you personally felt like as an individual, like in your first year running the corporation or like or running your not-for-profit, or how was that like actually?
Yeah, I'd be lying or I'd be naive if I said it wasn't stressful. There's obviously a lot of stress involved with making sure that as an organization we're maintaining responsibility as an organization, both to our members, but also to the government of Canada. Obviously, considering our official status and considering that we are a registered nonprofit, we have to maintain financial regularities and we have to maintain financial strictness as an organization to make sure that overall we are cooperating with the rules that are set out for us. So that process was very stressful. In our first year, we also had to put in significant work to try to solicit donations and partnerships with local organizations in the community, particularly certain corporations that we had either received business from as individuals or just generally wanted to, participate in the operation of our conference. We had a lot of local businesses and local organizations that wanted to reach out and provide an amount of money, and they did so without expecting anything in return. Financially speaking, we ended up giving those organizations a shout out at the end of our conference for helping make it possible, but otherwise, that's all they did. And it was a very fun process because we were able to, again, grow our community and grow those connections and help to make sure that as a whole, these organizations are represented as well in the community. So it's a very stressful process to make sure that our conference was operating financially stable and operating financially in a way that would allow us to give back as well. But by the end of our first year, again, we ended up, once reimbursements were complete and once the amounts were totaled, we ended up being able to give away $1,200 to those local charities, which was an amount that really none of us expected going into it. And again, having pretty much zero experience going into it and only around 6 months of preparation for the actual conference itself, we consider that a very significant achievement. And since then have endeavored to continue giving back to the community in bigger ways.
Perfect. I know you talked about fundraising, and I want to talk more about that for a bit. What was your I guess specifically, what was the process of reaching out to donors like, or people, or actually finding funding for your and how did you raise up funding outside of maybe donations?
Yeah, so the main source of funds for our conference and our organization in general is the registration fees that delegates or students actually pay for the conference. So as a student, you're a delegate. You get to participate for a 2 to 3 day conference. And what you get with that is you get to go, you get to participate, and then if you perform well, you might get an award out of it. So that's the main source of our actual income. Aside from that, we also have certain community organizations that we partner with. We usually end up going to them. We actually have a whole sponsorship package that we put together. And we go to these organizations and we ask if they might be willing to give an amount of money in exchange for being shouted out at our conference. And at the end of the day, we specify that any money that we earn in profit is going to be put back into the community and that none of us are going to take it for ourselves or for the membership. which is a very special status that, of course, you only get to do as a not-for-profit. If you're just a for-profit corporation, there you may not have as good luck with trying to get money in for your org. So what we ended up doing in our first year was a lot of that and a lot of cold emailing to local partners, to local organizations who we know might be willing to sponsor our event, and they ended up reaching back to us. And we ended up again getting around, I believe it was about $1,000 in donations from those organizations to make sure that our conference was able to run. And again, our really in our first year specifically, our conference would not have been possible without those organizations, and we've kept up those relationships to this day.
That's that's actually really cool. Specifically, you mentioned especially in the first year, because I know you mentioned that it was got a lot easier to build relationships with people in the community, and especially as you mentioned, Markham and Markham has grown so much. I imagine it's probably easier now to make to fundraise than ever. But in your first year, was it like, especially with cold emailing, like that does sound very challenging. I guess what was that like? Was that like nerve-wracking? Is that difficult?
Absolutely. No, 100%. I think it was definitely an nerve-wracking process to go about, creating a sponsorship package, describing what exactly our organization was about to, technically speaking, people who had never heard of us before, because we were a brand new organization. We were fresh on the ground. And at the end of the day, yeah, your average corporation might look at a bunch of students trying to run a conference and they might question it. But at the end of the day, I think we were able to put our best foot forward, particularly by talking to organizations that we knew had a stake in the community, just like we did, and would obviously want to specifically see an event like this put forward that was educational at the end of the day, which is one of the main things we pride ourselves on at Markman is for every single participant to get out of the weekend feeling like they've learned something, feeling like they've taken something with them. And I feel like as a nonprofit organization, it's a great goal to stand on, and it's something that we pride ourselves on.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I guess now, specifically outside of your first, I want to ask what the tradition, like transition from your first conference into like both your second and now your third iteration has been like, specifically for your personal experience. How have you found like, or how has your involvement in Markman changed for this upcoming conference and last conference, for example, as opposed to your first year?
Yeah, so now having no longer had a direct hand in the actual organizing of the conference, which admittedly I do miss a little bit, now I have more of a stake as, obviously a member of the board, as a director. And I find that role equally as important, if not at times more so, by being able to pass on knowledge instead of actually creating something new. I feel like that experience as well is very valuable because we get to see the same, creation of new experiences, of new knowledge being forged by, those bright high school students who end up running our conference. But we also get to pass along tips and tricks that we learned through our experience and just generally make sure that the organization is running at proper capacity. It generally does mean that we don't always get to see and experience the fruits of the labor from the conference firsthand because it's more so the organizers who get to enjoy that, and all credit to them, they absolutely deserve it. But we still get a part in seeing the conference and seeing it come together, and I feel like that process it's very heartwarming for sure.
I'm glad. It certainly sounds like it, especially when you're like mentor, like when like people eventually do become directors and you're able to teach them a lot.
Yeah,
I
it's
want to
very much a
talk.
mentor mentee type of role for sure.
Mhm. I wanted you mentioned that you kind of miss the hands-on aspect of organizing. Was that your favorite part of running I guess, being part of Markman? Or would you say was your favorite part of being running the nonprofit was
I
organizing
think
the activities?
I think it's very equal. I obviously have very much enjoyed my involvement with the board of directors, and it's why I've stuck around to this day, obviously, even after, a couple of years now. But, despite all that, yeah, of course, I do miss a little bit of the hands-on organizing for a big conference, being able to put together effectively a big show for high schoolers to enjoy and participate in. And those debates and Model UN in general, I find was a very big extracurricular for me growing up as a high schooler. Right from grade nine, I was very passionate about public speaking, and Model UN is where I formed some of my closest friends. So to me, especially, it's been a very community focused experience right from the beginning. But that's not just the case for me; it's the case for most people that I know who have been involved with Model UN, and most people who I know have been involved with Mark One as well.
Okay. That's actually a really good answer. I guess also just not exactly on that, but I guess somewhat related. I know at this point like, we've mentioned a lot about the stresses that you've taken on, like more so in your first year, but even like now. as you transitioned. I also know independently that you do a lot of stuff outside of like, or you're very cool. You do a lot of really cool stuff outside of your not-for-profit. The first thing I would think if I was thinking about starting a not-for-profit was how busy would this be? So I want to ask how you've been able to manage your responsibilities both as a director of a not-for-profit in university, but also as like a university student or as someone who does all the other cool things you do end up you have been doing.
Yeah, it's not an easy process. Again, there's a lot of time management that goes into that. A lot of the skills that I learned from year one of Mark One back in 2024, I've carried to this day and continue to use. I find that the most useful thing has been just trusting in the people we have on board. I think the secretariat we have on Mark One this year is just as good as the one we had last year, is just as good as the one we had before that. And you know we've continued to see gradual improvement year over year. And that's been something that's very comforting to see because I have it in the back of my mind that even though I'm, co-running a very important nonprofit in my local community, at the same time, I trust that the people involved are going to do their jobs, and I trust that they're going to be focused on these community endeavors first. And every individual who signed up for this conference, whether it be a participant or a member of staff or secretariat or board, you can ask any one of them, and they'll say that the reason they got involved was because they love Model UN and they love the community.
Perfect. I guess the last question I have is not what your favorite, I guess what the biggest challenge, because we've talked a lot about the challenges you've had to face. Is there any one challenge you would say is probably the biggest, that was the most difficult for you to overcome, and specifically running the not-for-profit?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest ones was probably some of our initial challenges, again, with making money and with earning money, taking money in to actually organize the conference. In our first year, we had a budget of around $7,000. Our second year, around 10,000, give or take. Um, it's very difficult for a group of high school students and even university students to come up with that kind of money. And it was obviously a massive challenge with making sure that we were moving our money properly, that we were planning for contingencies. Even the $200 fee to incorporate is for a young person a pretty significant cost, which is why to anybody I've talked about with my Markmont experience, I've always stressed that it's very important that you form those partnerships with your community and you really get out there and you put yourself out there, which is a scary process in and of itself, but it's one that pays dividends, not literally, but figuratively, in the long term, with being able to form those connections that you can keep and being able to make a difference in your community for the long term.
Perfect. No, that makes a lot of sense. I guess finally, on I guess the challenges, and maybe this isn't directly in response to this specific challenge. If there is one piece, I have two more questions before we open it up to others if anyone else has any questions. First is if you could go back in time and actually talk to yourself before you started your not-for-profit, what's the one advice you would actually give, piece of advice you'd give, or the one thing you think was the most important to say?
Trust the process.
Yeah.
Trust that at the end of the day, things are going to go well. And that if you focus on the needs of the community and you focus on why you were doing all this, things will go well and things will turn out. I had a lot of stress with regards to the conference back then. I think so did a lot of my peers who were helping to run it in our initial year. But I think working together and being able to collaborate on that process and having each other was the biggest thing. So that's absolutely what I tell myself.
Okay, that's a very good answer. And finally, um, the final, just why not? Why do you both? What do you think is a unique role of not-for-profits as an, or why do you think people should uniquely start not-for-profits if they want to benefit the community, for example?
Yeah, I think that the biggest thing is if you care about your community and you see a need in your community that needs to be fulfilled. Whereas, we have a lot of systems of power in our society, and we have a lot of different systems of government, for example, that try to fulfill the needs of society in many ways. Like, for example, for those experiencing poverty, we have government supports in place to help them succeed and to help them get their foot on the ground. In the same way, non-for-profit corporations operate very similarly. They see a need in the community. Whereas, for example, we want high schoolers to have an opportunity to engage in fruitful discussion with each other on relevant topics that are important in our day-to-day world, whether it be foreign affairs, whether it be within Canada, or whether it be a more engaging topic or a more fun topic. There's a lot of things that high schoolers want to talk about that oftentimes they find themselves having little avenues to go to. And with Mark One, that was exactly what we sought to engage with, along with benefiting the community. So if you see a purpose in your community, if you see a challenge, attack it. really address it with your nonprofit and try to find ways to get involved and give back as well. That's the advice I always give.
Perfect. Thank you so much.